Thank you very much, Luca, for that very generous and warm and welcoming introduction. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here at Villanova. Can you hear in the back? Is it okay? Well, I've organized this lecture into three parts. So the first part is going to deal with the "and" part, the birth of cinema. What do we mean when we talk about the birth of cinema? So I'm going to begin with some theoretical concepts, some terms from film and media studies. Then in the second part, I'm going to concentrate on Dante's Inferno from 1911 by the Milano Film Company, which is a very important film in the history of cinema. And thirdly, I'm going to give you a brief panorama of some recent instances of Dante intersecting with the media, including a video game, an avant-garde TV program, and similar kinds of phenomena. So it has this kind of reach. The center and the heart of it really is this 1911 film, and I'm going to take you back and lead up to how I hope you try to understand and appreciate that film, coming back to it from earlier points in film history. So Luca mentioned the book Dante, Cinema, and Television, and one might think of the topic Shakespeare and film, for example, which is a big topic, which is taught at many universities, which has a lot of scholarship. Shakespeare actually is a dramatist, so maybe it's not that surprising that there'd be a lot of films based on Shakespeare, that there'd be a long history of performance, and one could do a lot of scholarship on Shakespeare and film. But maybe it's a bit more surprising to learn that Dante and cinema is a topic that also has a considerable amount of scholarship, and that we might ask, and I'm just going to point to some of the examples of that. There's a conference on Dante and Fellini to be held in Ravenna in Italy this summer. Ravenna is the place where Dante is buried. Dante on View, the reception of Dante in the Visual and Performing Arts, edited volume. Dante, Cinema and Television, another edited volume, and Dante nel Cinema, an Italian volume on this essay. And it's the late Amilcare Iannucci, who worked very well and productively on this topic, and he, in a book of his called Dante Contemporary Perspectives, he argues the Commedia produced not only a philological response, that is, commentaries and scholarly interpretive works, but also a creative response. It inspired the production of other objects, independent of its structure, in both the artistic and literary spheres. And we're going to look at some of those today. Amilcare Iannucci talks about what he calls producerly qualities in Dante's literary art. So if we think about the Divine Comedy, it has incredible visual aspects to it. It's a visionary text that has amazing visual power to re-evoke mountains, streams, cities. It has this incredible visual power, but also it has an amazing dramatic power. So it has a list of characters who are unforgettable, dramatic scenes that are constructed by Dante. So these producerly qualities that Amilcare Iannucci talks about in the original text lead to centuries of reinvention, refraction, refrying, whatever you want to call it, of reinventing, of reworking with Dante. And we're going to look at some of that in terms of early cinema today. What we're talking about, we're in the realm of Dante reception. How has the text been received? What have people done with this text? And this is the index, this is the table of contents from Dante on View, broken down into three sections. Dante in performance, the comedy as a text for performance. In the 19th century alone, there were some 60 plays that were inspired by Dante. So this is a text that's producing interpretations in other media, in other modes. Dante on the 19th century stage is a very interesting article that studies not only Italian plays based on Dante, but also in the English language. Some 60 plays in the 19th century. So these plays are an important antecedent for the film that I'm going to focus on in 1911. Then Dante in the visual arts, the image of Dante, poet and pilgrim. So the image of Dante that we have on the Villanova Dante conference series has a history, right? So there's an iconography, there's a history of images of Dante that go back to the Middle Ages, certain illustrated manuscripts, so people study this through the ages. Francesca observed painting and illustration is another important realm of Dante reception. So there are all kinds of paintings, sculptures, interpretations. Dante, the Divine Comedy, lends itself to this kind of revisiting. And finally, the topic that we'll be concentrating on today, Dante in the cinema and multimedia. Let me call your attention now to the handout. There's a first quotation here from Raymond Williams on film history. And what this lecture is really about is to think of film as a new medium that emerges on the margins of culture. And it seeks to move towards the center of culture by associating itself with established forms of culture. So this will play out in different ways in different national contexts, but that basically is the prototype of cinema as a new medium. So when we talk about, we're familiar with talking about new media today, but when we're talking about cinema, we're talking about an old medium, we're talking about when it was new, when it emerged. So this metaphor of the birth of cinema is something that I'm going to pursue a bit at length. But the first quote here from Raymond Williams, film was to become the central art form of the 20th century, but it took a long time, longer in some nations and in some classes than in others, for this centrality to be recognized in relation to already established culture. From its marginal beginnings, within both the content and the institutions of popular culture, it made its way to a qualitatively different position, not only or even primarily because of its individual qualities as art, but mainly because of the radical change in the means of artistic production employed. In the early decades, most cinema industries tried to move towards respectability within the terms of the established culture. I'm going to show you some images that will take us back to understanding film emerging as a media. But both in the United States and in Italy and internationally, Dante's Inferno of 1911 helped put the cinema on a new, it helped it in its process of becoming the institution of cinema. So think of film as a new medium over about a 20-year process becoming the institution of cinema. This takes about 20 years from, say, 1895 to 1915. The points of origin for the history of cinema are international. This is, I think, the best way to think about film history today, the new film history as media archaeology. This is the title of an essay by Thomas L. Césaire. So there was a point where film was separated out of other media and one studied its history. And now, because of our own media age, we see the convergence of so many media. And cinema today is linked with other forms of media. And so the whole history of cinema looks very different now. And there's more of seeing it as part of other media. Also, media archaeology is interesting. Archaeology suggests something in fragments. So there's a bit more of a humble attitude, you might say, on the part of film historians and media historians to look back and see we don't have a clear map, but our map is in fragments. And this part of what's driving interest in early cinema is our own media age. So the new technologies that we are experiencing. Another strong and important paradigm here, a medium is always born twice. So the medium emerges and then it becomes institutionalized. So we think of film emerging and then becoming institutionalized as cinema. So studies of early cinema have spilled over into the study of other media, where early cinema is seen as a kind of paradigm for the study of media change in general. So these two scholars, a medium is always born twice. We are in the realm of cultural reception, not just Dante reception, but cultural reception. What was the cinema? What is the identity of film as a new medium during its emergence? Remediation is another important topic, theme, critical term in media studies today. The logic by which new means of communication remake the preceding ones. Incorporation or representation of one medium in another medium. Remember, Marshall McLuhan famously said, the content of any medium is always another medium. And what we're looking at here on the right-hand side is still from an Italian comic film from the teens. And what you're looking at is a medieval telephone. So the joke is obviously in the Middle Ages there were no telephones, but this is part of this comic film to think about this medieval telephone. What we're looking at on the right side here is a magic lantern slide. So the magic lantern was one of the most important antecedents of the film medium. And this is a magic lantern slide which is remediating an earlier peep show device. So we see monkeys looking into this box, which was one form of visual entertainment, also had scientific purposes. So the history of cinema today is seen as part of this history of media archaeology. In fact, there's a professor at the University of Chicago, Thomas Gunning, who was a very prominent scholar of early cinema. He teaches a course at the University of Chicago called Cinema in the 19th Century. And the whole point is there is no cinema in the 19th century. But this is where this field has gone, back to recuperating a long history of interrelated media. Intermediality is another phenomenon that we're dealing with, the participation of more than one medium of expression in the signification of a human artifact. This term follows the term intertextuality. About one literary text is made up of other literary texts. So we think of the Divine Comedy as being incorporating the scriptures, but also Virgil, Ovid. So this kind of intertextuality has been something that people have studied for many years. So intermediality is now coming forward in our age. Another important antecedent of early film, besides the magic lantern, is the illustrated book. So for centuries, the illustrated book, but particularly in the 19th century, major novels were illustrated. When we get to the 20th century with more modernist forms of literature, the illustrated book really goes by the way, but we have to remember that in the 19th century, the illustrated book was very prominent. In fact, for the film that we're going to look at briefly tonight, Dante's Inferno of 1911, the major primary intermedial reference is Gustave Doré's illustrations of the Divine Comedy, which were widely diffused in the 19th century, and the filmmakers pretty much copied that iconography. The film looks very much like Doré's illustrations. Another interesting connection between illustrated books of the 19th century and early film has to do with continuity editing. So if you remember films, when they begin to tell a language, continuity editing is an important way to create a sense of contiguous spaces. So we see a figure in one space and then entering into another space. This is a way of creating narrative with film language, but we find that already in illustrated books in the 19th century. Here's an example from an Italian, I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed. We have Fra Cristoforo, and I'm not sure who's accompanying him, but knocking on the door outside of this gate, this portone, and on the facing page, we see them entering into that same space. So this kind of use of contiguous spaces that we're familiar with in film actually has an antecedent in the 19th century illustrated books. This is an illustration of the magic lantern. Let me direct your attention to the third quote on the handout. David Robinson: contemporary researchers often expend much time and effort in trying to establish the exact moment of the birth of moving pictures. For the showmen and spectators of the late 19th century, there was no such moment. Moving pictures were not born, but represented a stage in the natural evolution of the magic lantern. The magic lantern had had more than 2 centuries to develop highly sophisticated techniques and a wide range of uses for entertainment and instruction prior to the emergence of moving pictures. Also, with regard to Dante's Inferno, this was a popular topic for magic lantern shows in preceding centuries. And in Padova, there's a museum of the magic lantern, and they have all kinds of magic lantern slides on shows, and they periodically put on shows, and Dante is one of their topics that they like to come up with from time to time. Also, in terms of exhibition spaces, so I'm in the realm of talking about film as a new medium emerging on the margins of the culture. To understand the role that Dante's Inferno of 1911 plays in helping it elevate its level in terms of its cultural status, but also as an industry. So films were shown in beer halls, in taverns, in fairgrounds, before cinema was housed, before the establishment of places where people went to watch moving pictures. This is an example of a magic lantern slide from an illustrated book by Carlo Collodi called La Lanterna Magica di Giannettino. And the illustrations, so it's a book that uses the magic lantern as a way of organizing the narrative. And the illustrations are also pretending to be magic lantern slides. This book, towards the end, we have one of the high points in the Italian unification, that is a famous handshake between Vittorio Emanuele and Giuseppe Garibaldi at Teano. So this occurs towards the end of the book. So it's also occupying the place of the apotheosis. So in popular media of the 19th century, popular theater, dioramas, panoramas, illustrated books, the most important position is towards the end, where we have an image that encapsulates the meaning of what came before. So it has allegorical significance. We see in early cinema, we see the continuation of this apotheosis from the 19th century. The kinetoscope. We also have the story of the technologies, the racing towards creating moving images. Since we're, well, in the United States, one of the big historical factors that led to interest in moving pictures was the Civil War. So all of those injured people, all of those men who needed prostheses, who needed artificial limbs, this led to the study of the human body in motion. This is one of the factors driving interest in the human body in motion. So in Europe, there were other factors, but there are part of the history of early cinema, obviously, are the inventors, the technological aspects. And Edison gave us the kinetoscope. The Lumiere brothers, with their cinematograph, had really the winning ticket, because this was a machine that they could travel around the world and take images of people in the morning and then organize showings in the evening. So before YouTube, before all of the, what we're used to taking pictures with our cameras and sending them around, this was part of the attraction of early film, was the gee whiz factor, the wow factor of seeing moving pictures, and also of seeing yourself or people you recognized in these moving pictures. This was part of the success of the Lumiere brothers rather than Thomas Edison. The Lumiere cinematograph was set up with the use of a magic lantern that could also project images. So in a way, this PowerPoint demonstration is part of the new film history as media archaeology, this kind of screen practice, this kind of exhibition practice that goes back to early cinema. Here's an example of a film wagon. So this is before, around 1905, places to go, purpose-built cinemas begin to be built. But before that, the 10 years preceding are what's called mobile exhibition sites, fairground cinema. In Italian, it's called il cinema ambulante, literally the cinema that walks. It's moving exhibition sites. Here's an example of a kind of moving picture wagon. So you see how it looks like a fairgrounds attraction. That's what it was. It was a fairgrounds attraction, along with the snake man, the belly dancer, the corn dogs, whatever get people to the fair. That's what moving pictures were. Notice all the different names. So what is the cinema? What is the film as a new medium? It's a technological marvel. It's the latest discovery, the latest scientific discovery of the 19th century. That is what it is at the beginning. It's a machine, it's an apparatus. And Thomas Edison, for some reason, forgot to patent the kinetoscope in Europe. So people took his technology and readapted it and called it something else and tried to make it work for them, including an Italian comic by the name of Leopoldo Fregoli. He actually bought a cinematograph from the Lumiere brothers and worked it into a stage act and called it the Fregoli graph. He was a quick change artist. He could go behind the scenes and come back and change. He could be Verdi, then he would duck down and come back up as Wagner, then he could duck down and come back up as Beethoven. This was the kind of sleight of hand he engaged in, and he brought the cinematograph in, and he confounded the boundary between the human and the apparatus. And this actually is that boundary between human labor and the machine that is the beginning of film acting. To recognize when someone is acting in a film rather than just a spectacle being filmed. Part of early film, for example, animals performing, boxing kangaroos. That's not film acting. That's just kangaroos boxing. Anyway, this is part of the history of early cinema, and frequently confounded those boundaries. Here's an example of cinema ambulante set up in a piazza. Back to Thomas Edison. Although his apparatus did not win out in the competition with the Lumiere brothers, his name had an important reverberation in the reception of cinema. So early cinema was also linked in Italy with the name of Thomas Edison, who was already known for bringing electric light to the city of Milan. He was already present in photography circles and was known as an inventor. In fact, it was rumored that he was working on a machine to cure blindness, which never came about, but he did leave his name. This is Cinematografo Sala Edison. This is in Florence. So we see cinemas named after Edison. In fact, school children were taken to see moving pictures and given lectures, and it was under the scientific patrimony, you might say, of Thomas Edison. He couldn't stay out much longer. Here we have a purpose-built cinema. So around 1905, we start to get purpose-built cinemas, places that are built for the purpose of showing moving pictures. And those exhibition spaces had different names. In Italy, some like Splendor, Fulgor, Excelsior, grandiose names, but also Cinema Dante. So we see Dante as a form of established culture, helping the new film media move towards the center of culture through forms of established culture. This is a concluding slide, a concluding shot from the film called La Presa di Roma, The Taking of Rome in 1905. This is the apotheosis scene, similar to the one I showed you earlier from the illustrated book with Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel shaking hands. Here we have Italy, the unification of Italy, configured as a woman, and with the founding fathers. This is an apotheosis scene. Well, Dante in the 19th century in Italy is primarily configured as a political figure foreseeing Italian unification. Monuments to Dante begin to be constructed in 1865, really following the model of Shakespeare as the national poet of England. So Italy comes to the wave of nation-making, unification comes late to Italy, the 19th century. Italy is an ancient civilization, but as a modern country, it's rather young, younger than the United States. Dante plays a role as a kind of prophet, as a political figure who Italians use to create a national, both in terms of national consciousness of Italian, making Italians, but also as a point, a rallying point. So these monuments to Dante serve an important purpose. And in Dante's Inferno of 1911, in the American version, the monument to Dante at Trento is the opening shot. But in the original Italian version, the monument to Dante at Trento is the final concluding shot. It's the apotheosis. And that final shot, that apotheosis, was censored in 1912 in Italy, because Italy had a treaty with Austria, and it did not want to offend Austrian sensibilities. But when Italians saw this film, and with the Dante monument at the end, it's a message about Italian unification, about making Italians, whereas in the American context, the Dante monument doesn't have any of those connotations. It's just a kind of introduction to Dante. This is an example of the plasticity of early films. These films were produced, and then they traveled, and people felt perfectly entitled to change they had to change the intertitles. They had to put them in other languages. They cut and spliced these films. Films heading for Russia, they needed a tragic ending. They didn't want happy endings. So when you go back and look, so the restoration of these films also is a very interesting part of their reception. How do we receive them today? But let's go a little bit further on this story. So here we have Film d'arte Italiana with a film by Otello, Shakespeare. This is 1908. So a French company, Film d'Art. It begins in 1907, and the idea of this company is to produce films based on famous writers, famous actors, and famous works of literature. So this, back to our paradigm again. The cinema moves towards the center of the culture by associating itself with established forms of culture. So this film series begins in France. Italy takes it up with Othello, and 1911 is our film Dante's Inferno, which I'm going to kind of cut to the chase here a bit. It's an important film for the transition from the short to the feature-length film. So we're accustomed, when we go to the movies, we expect to see a film for maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours. At this moment in film history, people are used to going to seeing maybe 5 or 6 films that are going to last, 3-4 minutes. There is really no sense. People go, when the purpose-built cinemas are, people go to the movies. They go there as if they would go, say, to a bar or a restaurant. They're going to a place for a certain kind of entertainment. They're not going yet to see one film. So Dante's Inferno of 1911 is an important film in this transition to what's considered the feature-length film, to go to see a particular movie. This was also the longest film yet made at 1,250 meters. It was the most expensive film yet made, at costing 100,000 lire. It won the support of the cultural establishment. In Italy, it was screened in Naples in the presence of Benedetto Croce, Matilde Serrao, and others. It had similar kinds of success in France. It was screened at the Sorbonne. In the United States, the cost of a ticket was $2.50. So we contrast that with the Nickelodeon, which was a place you could enter for 5 cents and watch moving pictures. So this is part of this move towards the institutionalization of cinema. It was also important for the new means of distribution. So Gustavo Lombardo was the distributor, and he gained worldwide rights for this film. So this is the first example we have of a film in which the distributor had the right to distribute it around the globe. He also came up with an innovative way of distribution and exhibition, and that is he sold the rights by zones. So if you owned a film theater in Liverpool, he would sell you the right to show the film, but it was by zone. So you didn't have to worry about the person next to you paying the same amount of money, and you would be kind of out, you wouldn't have that relationship with the film that you wanted. So this was innovative. It had to do with the film's success. Selling it by zones. And also a modern advertising campaign. So this is the first film that we have with a modern advertising campaign, and Gustavo Lombardo. The slide doesn't capture it all, but playing with Dante's Inferno. Never before was such a wonderful production put upon the British market. You can go as far as you want. There's nothing to beat it. A most remarkable scene takes place when Virgil takes Dante through the gates of hell. So this is all part of what Americans call ballyhoo, right? About circus-like exhibition to gain attraction, to gain interest. So at this point in film history, we can't, it's a different world. People are coming from the 19th century. They're used to a different visual culture. They're used to a theater, which already has different kinds of theater. So film, to take its place among this media environment, presents itself in different ways. But this film, Dante's Inferno of 1911, goes a long way in this regard. Well, I think I want to go to some clips now, because I think that's important. And this slide is just reiterating what I've already said. It's just somebody else is saying it. But let me take you to some examples of clips from a restored version done by the people in Bologna, Il Cineteca di Bologna, Il Cinema Ritrovato. This would take us, part of this story is how cinema becomes intertwined with Italian identity in the 20th century, so Italy becomes a country in which film culture is very important. Italy is a country that has an extraordinary number of film festivals. And it leads the world in terms of restoration of early films. Why is this? Because Italy, over the course of the 20th century, became a country in which film became intertwined with the identity of Italians, with the politics, over the course of the 20th century. And I'm going to play for you a few minutes from the Milan Film Company, Dante's Inferno of 1911. Very interesting story being told here. See the international cooperation of archives. I want to give you a sense of the music that's used here as well. That's why I'm going to this version. Notice that the camera is static, the camera doesn't move, so the human figure moves through the space. Let me take you back now to, well, let's look on the handout, the fourth quote on the handout. So in Moving Picture World, 1912, W. Stephen Bush gave some hints to exhibitors about what he thought they should do for the music for this film. So the word silent film is really a misnomer. The films did not have the celluloid strip that was mechanical or reproduced sound, but they were always accompanied by a piano, sometimes by an orchestra, a lecturer. And here we have an example of that. So W. Stephen Bush says, wherever possible, an orchestra of 6 or 8 pieces should accompany the pictures. In the absence of such an orchestra, there should be at least 2 instruments, a piano and a good organ, one not over 50 years of age. It is folly to employ cheap men to play organ and piano. The methods of conducting a gents' furnishing store will not apply here. The organ's place is behind the screen. The piano had best be placed in the orchestra. Part of the William Tell overture is especially recommended because it is generally at hand and the musicians are more or less familiar with it. After this overture follows the brief introductory of the lecturer, and at its conclusion comes the next distinct number of the musical program, the Garibaldi Hymn, which may be found in any of the ordinary collections of national anthems. This air is believed to be suitable for several reasons. It has plenty of fire and spirit, is in keeping with the initial titles in the original Italian, and last but not least, is sure to please the Italian part of your audience, which is generally large. Italians come to see the Inferno because they revere the genius of their immortal countryman, Dante Alighieri, who wrote the Inferno. The strains of the Garibaldi hymn should be continued until the first scene of the Inferno proper appears, showing Dante lost in the gloomy forest, when the music gives way to the lecturer. So this quote gives us a sense of the exhibition of this film in 1912 in the United States. Now what I'd like to share with you, cutting through some of these images, is a restored version of 1911 with music, contemporary music by the group Tangerine Dream, and see what the contrast here. I'm going to cut a little bit through this introductory material and get us to kind of what we just saw. Let me see, right about there. This is obviously extra-diegetic music. It's music as commentary. So she's singing about Dante and Virgil, whereas the early accompaniment was rather sober, plain. So the history of cinema is the history of media and how we interact with it. A couple just really quick examples I'm going to skip over. I made this handout especially for this purpose. We're not going to take the time to go through these 52 films, but I wanted to give you a sense of there are 52 films, and we could look at different moments in film history. But here is one very interesting, I think the most interesting TV avant-garde production, and this is just a clip of about 30 seconds.
The city of despair. Through me, eternity of grief. You that enter here, abandon hope. Considering your plight, I think it best that you should follow me. I'll be your guide and lead you out to the eternal world.
Let me take you briefly to another example. This one, a contemporary, whoops, here we go. Dante's Inferno, the video game. I've never played this video game, but one of my students happened to tell me the other day it was one of his favorite video games. And most recently, a film based on this video game. Well, our sound seems to have cut out from us here, but we're going to see the same beasts that we saw at the beginning of the other versions that we saw making their appearance shortly. But since you can't hear it and you have to strain, I think we'll just move on. And I'm coming here to my concluding remarks. So we might say that Dante, as we said, in the 19th century, primarily was used in Italy as a symbol of national unification. In the 20th century, though, in the early 20th century, fascism has other ideological uses of the past that have to do with Romanness, but also Dante becomes discovered by artists. So in a way, he becomes available to artists in a way that before it was more the political figure. And take us back to our own moment in our own place, 750 years celebrating Dante, and Villanova University is part of these global celebrations of Dante. I think it makes me just to reflect Dante, what he's contributed to Western civilization, but not just Dante, but also the love of Italy. That Dante becomes a kind of synecdoche or cinema for Italy as a whole. And I'm reminded by something that a poet, Andrea Zanzotto, said, that Italy is something more and something less than a nation, which is rather poignant, but something more in the sense that Italy, obviously, Italian civilization, the antiquity of Italian civilization, that Italy is the link to the ancient world. Italy is our first link to Greece and Rome, something more than a nation. Also, in terms of other cultural expressions, La Commedia dell'arte, for 2 centuries in Europe, was a transnational form of comedy that exceeds the national dynamic. Also, opera is another example of Italy as something more than a nation, what Italy has given the world. The language of music is Italian. Opera is Italian. These are examples of Italy as something more than a nation. Something less probably has to do with the political difficulties of unifying late and joining in a historical process of nation states to which Italy comes late and comes with its own rich historical past that doesn't necessarily lend itself to this political model. But cosmopolitanism is also a tradition of Italy. What Italian intellectuals, scientists, writers have given the world beyond the national confines of Italy. So this too is part of the Italian legacy, part of the Italian cultural patrimony, and this is part of what we celebrate when we celebrate Dante. So I congratulate Luca Cotini and Villanova for participating in this broader system of celebrations. Thank you.